In this lesson, we'll learn how to use the gradient tool here inside of Photoshop, as well as how we can begin to customize our own gradients. Okay, great. So I've got our Lesson 28 Begin file open, and you'll see here that it's just simply an empty file. We're going to use this to sort of experiment with our gradients at the moment. So let's come over here and grab our gradient tool. Again, the keyboard shortcut for that is G. So the first thing you need to know about this gradient tool, before we begin to draw down here on the canvas, is that the gradient is drawn from left to right up here with this gradient selector. So you can see when I click on my canvas, let's just say I click on the left-hand side here, and I drag across my canvas. We'll just kind of drag a straight line. You can see here that it is drawn from black, and that gradient moves to white. And that kind of mimics this bar over here. So if we were to come in and drag that from right to left, it's going to start with black again. So in this case, the gradient is always going to start on the left-hand side of this little preview up here. Now, these are linear gradients. I've drawn them twice for you now. So the basic types of gradients are right up here, and we can select any of these 5 types. You can see the next type here is a radial gradient. We can just click and drag and draw sort of a radius that color is transitioning in from black in the center to white on the exterior. The next one is going to be our angle gradient. So if I were to come in and drag from the center out, you can see here that it sort of is almost like a cone, and it has kind of a seam right here. Again, the next one here is going to be our reflected gradient. Now, if we just click at the top and drag all the way down, it's going to look like a linear gradient. But let's click in the center and drag down, and you'll see the core difference. Let me try that one more time. We'll click in the center and drag down. Accidentally hit one of the buttons on my stylus. There we go. So you can see in this case, we've got basically the black is being drawn out in both directions, or rather the gradient is being drawn out starting with black in both directions. So if we dragged it from the center to the right, again, you're going to see black in the center gradiating to white on either side of the point we start with. And the last one here is our diamond gradient. So if I were to click in the center and drag out, you'll see here that there's sort of a diamond shape that's drawn. Now, we can actually constrain kind of the drawing of these gradients to 45-degree angles just simply by holding down the Shift key on our keyboard. So you can see here it's sort of snapping to those angles for me. All right, fantastic. So those are the different types of gradients that we can begin to draw here. Now, again, we have a blend mode option and an opacity option. Those are going to work very similar to the way we've seen them work in previous lessons, but we really don't have any pixel data yet to interact with. Let's skip over those for right now and come over here. So the reverse option is simply going to reverse the gradient. So if I were to click and drag, hold Shift, you can see here that it is simply reversed the little bar in the preview over here. So now we're drawing from white to black. So we'll uncheck that here. And transparency, it has to do with the gradient allowing transparency. Now, if we wanted to come in and unlock the background layer so we can actually utilize transparency, we can drag that padlock to the ground and just select all with a Control-A and delete. And then we could come in here and select one of these gradients, these presets here that actually has transparency involved. I'll go ahead and deselect with a Control-D, and we'll just go ahead and draw that same gradient again. And you can see here how this particular gradient has transparency as part of it. So let's go ahead and Control backspace and fill that layer with black here, because we saw kind of these presets down here. You can see we can choose from any of these default preset gradients here inside of Photoshop. Lots of different interesting color combinations, but this is not all we're limited to by any means. Let's come over here and we can drop this little list down by hitting that gear button. And you can see there are several different gradient libraries, just as there are with many other tools. So we could come in and grab maybe our Color Harmonies one and hit OK. And you can see it loads up a whole new set of gradient presets for us. If we ever want to reset that back, we can just come in and choose to reset our gradients and hit OK. And there we go. We're back to our default gradient library. All right, fantastic. So at this point, let's go ahead and instead of clicking on that little arrow next to our gradient preview, let's go ahead and click on the gradient itself, because by doing that, it's going to bring up our gradient editor here. Now, the gradient editor is got some different settings. Looks a little different than anything we've seen up until this point. So just keep in mind that up here in this presets area, that's where all of our gradient presets are. These are going to mimic the same ones that we saw in that drop down from the control panel earlier. Again, we have our little gear button here where we can start to load in various gradient libraries here, and we can control kind of the size of these thumbnail previews. Now, one thing you should understand is that when we were drawing those gradients earlier, if I cancel out of this, they were all from black to white. Now, the reason for that is because black and white are my foreground and background colors. If I came in here and selected a red color, you'll see here that the gradient up here changes. So let's come back in here and begin to customize our gradients in the gradient editor. You can see here that we have the foreground to background color is the default here. That's because that's that first one right there. We could give our gradient a name here. We'll just call it something like demo gradient. And you can see here that we can come in and choose the type of gradient as well. So right now we've been working with solid gradients. There's actually a noise gradient that we can begin to create like this. Very rarely do I ever use noise gradients, but we can come in and start to kind of randomize those. We can adjust the color model and some of these color sliders down here. Feel free to experiment with that if you'd like, but let's switch for right now back to solid. Now, this smoothness slider here controls how the gradient transitions from one color into another. The smoothness being at 100% means that that transition is going to be as smooth as possible. But we could come in and begin to adjust that if we'd like to. So this is the focal point of this gradient editor dialog right here, this gradient bar. So we have here two different kinds of stops on the bar. Down here below, we have our color stops. These are going to control the color of the gradient. You can see here that if I select this one, this color box becomes active, and it tells me that that particular stop is white. So let's just change that in color. Let's give that maybe kind of a light blue color here. Sort of like that. And you can see it actually changes the color here inside the gradient bar as well as for the stop itself. Notice also that with that one selected, the little arrow above it is actually black in color. So that way we can really quickly and easily tell which one of these stops we have selected. Now, the next setting here that we have control over for this selected color stop is its location. In its current position, it's at 100%, but you can see that changes as I begin to drag that to the left. All right. So as I drag this to the left, you're probably noticing one other element move here, and it's this little diamond shape right here. So let's go ahead and click on that, and you'll see here that really all this is a midpoint. That defines where 50% is between these two particular color stops. Right now it's set at 50%, but we can actually begin to adjust that. So if we want our gradient to be heavier on the blue side, you can see here that we can control where that halfway point is inside our gradient. So maybe we actually want that to be a little more of a black gradient, so we could drag that over here. But you can see as I begin to get really close, that gradient is going to start to tighten up and become more of a line between the two colors there. So let's go ahead and set that back to 50 here. So at this point, we've learned about the color stops. We can actually come in and add additional color stops right down here just simply by clicking with our cursor. And we can begin to adjust these, and you can see that each one of those has that midpoint diamond that can also be adjusted. If we want to remove one of these color stops, all we need to do is simply click it and drag it off of the gradient bar. There we go. Let's go ahead and maybe switch these places. We'll drag this guy over here and this guy over here. So we have our black kind of in the middle, and then we'll change the color of that black. Let's go ahead and give that sort of maybe an orange color. Something like that. So we've got this gradient we've created. Now we've looked at the color stops down here, but we haven't talked about these guys up here yet. These are your transparency stops. These control the transparency of your gradient at various places within the gradient. So you can see here we can actually come in and control the opacity as well as the location of these transparency stops. So if we want this one to maybe switch to like 50% opacity, we'll go ahead and drag that down to 50%. And we want it to switch to that right about there. We'll just go ahead and add another one here and drag that guy up to about 100%. And then we'll add one right here and sort of tighten that up. So you can see here how we can begin to incorporate transparency into our gradient. And again, with these transparency stops, we also have that midpoint diamond. We can control where that transition and the midpoint of it occurs. So just as with the color stops, if we want to get rid of these guys, all we need to do is simply click and drag them off. Now you can't drag off and create less than 2. So there has to be 2, both color stops as well as transparency stops. All right, great. So I want to come back up here and give this my name again. We'll just call that demo gradient. And let's say we want to go ahead and save this gradient so we can access it over and over again. All we need to do is hit that new button right there, and you can see it gets added to my gradient presets right here. Now again, this is added into the default gradient preset library. So if we actually want to come in and save this out, we need to use these buttons over here. So that the next time we actually switch here, maybe from our other additional gradient libraries, we don't actually lose our custom gradient. So with that said, let's go ahead and switch over here. There's our gradient in action. I want to go ahead and switch over here to this coral.jpg. Now this particular image is in your referenced files for your project files. So what I think is actually pretty interesting is if we were to come in here and load in maybe this photographic toning gradient library. So we'll go ahead and say OK to this, and I'll say no, I don't want to save my custom gradient. And by the way, that just deleted my custom gradient. So keep in mind you do need to save those if you want to retain those. And maybe we want to come in here and change this to something like text only, so we can kind of see the names of some of these custom gradients. So you can see that there are a number of them inside this photographic toning gradient library. Let's maybe come in and grab something like this sepia blue and see what that looks like. That actually looks pretty cool. So again, keeping in mind this is a destructive workflow, we could begin to apply this gradient right here on top of our background layer. But we would need to change the blend mode, because if we were to just come in and drop that in, it's just going to drop in a gradient and replace all those photographic pixels. So let me undo that, and I've switched to a radial gradient here. Maybe we can come in and add something like a soft light blend mode to this. And we can come in and start to sort of experiment some with our gradient and kind of look at some of the effects that we can begin to get. So I'm going to come in here and switch to a little different gradient, maybe the sepia 5. And you see that I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between reversing it and not reversing it. So and again, you know, we're not restricted to just keeping our gradients living on the canvas. We can actually begin to drag those all the way out here. So completely up to you. Feel free to experiment a little bit with these gradients, seeing what kind of effects that you can achieve. You can ultimately kind of get some really interesting photographs and effects for your photographs, especially using this photographic toning gradient library here. So in this lesson, we've learned how to use gradients and the gradient tool here inside of Photoshop. We've also learned how we can begin to customize the gradients that we create and then save them out for later use. All right, great. With that said, I want to kind of go on and move on to the next lesson at this point. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the brushes here inside of Photoshop that try and mimic natural media. So we'll do that in the next lesson.